You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 11th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead... Israel has struck sites in Syria over 300 times since the ousting of Assad. We'll ask why the violence is continuing and what the future holds for Syrian refugees. French President Emmanuel Macron hopes to name a new government within the next 48 hours. We'll catch up with developments from the coalition talks. China has launched the biggest military drill in decades around Taiwan. We'll have analysis on what this means for security in the region. We'll catch up with events in Ukraine as it emerges that Beijing has been supplying arms components to Kyiv. We'll have a look through the papers and have a roundup of urbanism news from our Zurich studio. And then...
Finland is a great country to make a living, to establish yourself, not only from the business perspective, but also Finland has been recognized as the happiest nation in the world for 7 years in a row.
That's the Finnish ambassador to Britain who's explaining why we should all move to Helsinki. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The International Rescue Committee, the IRC, aid organisation, says Sudan has topped a 2025 watch list of global humanitarian crises. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will submit a request to Parliament today to hold a vote of confidence, the necessary precursor to holding new federal elections after the collapse of his coalition last month. And South Korean police raided the office of President Yoon Suk-yeol in a widening investigation into the embattled leader's failed attempt to impose martial law. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, we begin the programme near the border of Turkey and Syria. Following the 12-day offensive by the HTS rebel group, which managed to overthrow the Assad dynasty on Sunday, there are many moving parts to this story. A new interim prime minister has been appointed. The US, Israel and Turkey are continuing to strike Damascus and surrounding areas. Russia says it's doing everything it can to contact the country's new rulers to secure the safety of Moscow's naval and air bases there. And there's an influx of refugees returning home. At the same time, Britain, Germany, Austria and Greece all say that they're suspending their processing of asylum claims for Syrians. Well, to catch up with it all, I'm joined now by Sophia Yan, who's a senior foreign correspondent for The Telegraph. Sophia, many thanks for making time to come on this show. I know you're very busy and you're in transit. You were trying to get across the border from Turkey into Syria. Where are you now?
So we're in Hatay province in southern Turkey, and here there are 3 border crossing points that have been opened for Syrians. Now, southern Turkey is an area that is home to many Syrian migrants who fled across 10, 12, 13 years ago or so, and now hundreds of them are trying to go home. And so I've been to different border crossing points in this part. The most busy one, Çilebözü, there's about 300-400 a day now crossing. The numbers are expected to grow. And these people, you go to this border crossing point, the vibe is a little bit nervous. People are excited to go, but not really sure what they'll see on the other side. They're happy to know that there's a chance finally to reunite with family. But again, the war is still ongoing. There are clashes still ongoing. And so it's very much an uncertain return home.
Can we talk about the war ongoing, because the violence is continuing? What's happening, particularly in terms of Israel?
Well, Israel's been striking sites across Syria. The thinking is to try to make sure major weapons infrastructure, for instance, chemical weapons, that things that should not fall into the wrong hands do not. They've also been striking some Russian bits on the western coast of Syria. And this has been ongoing now for the last few days. Basically, since the Assad regime fell, Israel started to move in. And so these clashes are ongoing. In the northeast, you have the Turks The Turkish forces are clashing with Kurdish groups. The fighting has not fully stopped. There has been a change. The Assad regime has fallen. This interim government is in place. But it's very much a moving scenario. It's very much in flux. And for all these people who are going home, again, this is something that will change with time. And they're taking so much with them. I mean, they were uprooted already from Syria once to Turkey. Some of them went onward to Europe. Many of them now coming back. Just yesterday, I met a man whose cousin had come from Germany. He'd flown from Germany to Turkey and was now in the south, waiting in line to cross back home to Syria. And so this is a story that is going to have global implications. I mean, this civil war in Syria that we saw, the Assad regime, this was one single event that caused so many migrants to flee to the UK, to Europe, to the US, to Turkey, elsewhere, and now possibly this movement backwards. But again, because the situation is changing so quickly on the ground, they might get there, and in a few weeks' time, few months' time, it might change so much that they need to leave again.
I mean, you talked about somebody coming back from Germany, and I know that Britain, Germany, Austria and Greece, they've all suspended asylum claims of Syrians in their countries. So are those people returning home, or are they in some kind of limbo left in Western Europe? Sophia. We seem to have a problem there with our connection to Sophia. So we're just looking at what's happening here in Syria at the moment. We've established that there is still military action going on, particularly by Israel, who's carried out over 300 strikes on Syrian territory since Sunday, which of course is when Assad fell. There are lots and lots of refugees flooding back into the country. Sophia is on the border, a three-way border crossing. She says people are coming not only from Turkey and from the region, but also from places further afield. And we were talking about those refugees and what they can expect in the country. I'm not sure if we have Sophia back with us at the moment. Sophia, you were talking about a German refugee who'd come back. What happens to those refugees in Germany, in Britain, in Austria and in Greece? Because those countries have all suspended the asylum claims of Syrians there.
Yeah, so for these different countries, what stopped is the continuing ongoing processing of applications. So if anybody's applying now or somebody had already applied, they're not looking at that right now until the situation on the ground in Syria becomes a little bit more clear. Those who have received status are allowed to remain. And so this is something, again, for governments, they're looking at what's happening in Syria. This is a story that has changed so quickly in such a short amount of time. It's really hard to know what even the next few hours will bring. And now for people who are looking to go back, a lot of them really just want to be able to see their family. Again, we're talking about people who haven't seen their families in 10 years or so. I met families with children who were born in exile, Syrian children going home for the first time. And now this first flood to return to Syria, a lot of them live in southern Turkey, which is at this point very close for them to go now that Turkey has opened more border crossing points. Some people were coming from Istanbul, for instance, taking a long 15-hour bus ride down from the north of Turkey down to the south in order to cross into Syria. But for many of these people, it's really about this family reunion, a chance to see people that they haven't in so long, and maybe a chance to restart the life that they had before. I met one family, they had a bakery in Idlib. They had a bakery also in Turkey, but the minute that they felt they could, they gathered everything, they packed everything they could find that they wanted to take into any empty container they had. They were using these empty compost sacks, blankets, rugs, clothes, shoes, toys, bicycles, kids' bicycles, and just taking it all across the border. And it right now is a fairly celebratory moment. But again, I cannot underscore more or enough, rather, how much things could still change on the ground.
And I mean, is there an expectation or a hope from a lot of people that they will also be reunited with those who've been detained but now released?
Yes, many Syrians looking for news about their missing relatives. There was a woman in Istanbul that I spoke to just as the regime fell on Sunday, and she was searching. Her brother is thought to be in Sednaya prison, which is known as this brutal slaughterhouse, some of the worst atrocities that the Assad regime committed in this prison. And She's been searching for news of her brother. She hasn't found anything yet. But for many people, this is the way it is. This is a chance maybe to find out some news from people that they haven't heard of and about in quite some time. But many other people lost relatives in Sednaya. Another man that I met, actually the cousin of this German Syrian who was now returning, they had a cousin who died because he'd been tortured to death at Sednaya. And so again, this homecoming is very bittersweet because it is a chance finally to go to their own country, but also it's a place that has wonderful and terrible memories.
Sophia, finally, you're talking about how quickly things are changing. One thing that has happened is that there's now a new interim prime minister. I wonder what you can tell us about him and whether he and his government will be internationally recognised. Is the rebel group no longer prescribed a terrorist organisation? How is that going to work?
So these are discussions that seem to be ongoing now across capitals in the world. Now, HTS, the leader, Jolani, this rebel coalition that kind of pushed through so quickly, they have made very clear that they do want to engage internationally. There was a push more recently prior to this move that they had to take over much of Syria to distance away from al-Qaeda, to try to shed these ties, to say that they have turned a corner, that they are not what they used to be, and that they will be a responsible actor. They've made announcements to this effect, saying that going forward, for instance, that they are interested in trying to communicate. There have been some meetings to that effect. How governments, for instance, in the US or the UK, whether they decide to take HCS off any lists, this is something that's being discussed and only time will tell. And again, we are in the early days. The Assad regime fell in the early hours of Sunday morning. Today is only Wednesday. And so this is a very, very young transitional government. But they do seem to be making inroads to getting the country back up and running again.
Sophia, thank you very much indeed. That's Sophia Yan there on the border between Turkey and Syria. And this is The Globalist. It's 8:12 in Paris, 7:12 here in London. Yesterday, for the first time since the June election left France with the hung parliament, the leaders of all parties, apart from the far left and the far right, convened together with President Emmanuel Macron for talks on forming a government. And I'm joined now by Simone Bouvier, who's our Monocle Paris bureau chief. Simone, you must be exhausted. You had the Olympics, then you had all the government stuff before and after the Olympics. You've had the international travel fair, you've had Notre Dame reopening, and this political crisis continues. How do you manage it all?
Yes, Georgina. Well, one day at a time, I guess, is the answer to your question. But it has been quite a lot, and we've been quite busy here at the Monocle Paris Bureau.
Well, let's talk about these talks, because no RN, no LFI there, the far right and the far left, respectively. Why weren't they included?
Well, Georgina, I think that the main idea is to try to widen the base of support for whatever government comes next after Michel Barnier was censured after he tried to force through a budget in the legislature. So the previous government had their kind of political destiny tied to the far right essentially approving or disapproving of what their plans were. And I think they're trying to avoid relying on the far right. That's the kind of first priority for this new government. So, the Constitution says President Macron is in charge of selecting the next prime minister. So what he's trying now is, instead of picking a prime minister that is going to kind of roughly agree with him on what the policy of the government should be, but is relying on the far right to stay in power, to kind of push a little bit to the left so that he can get support from center-left former adversaries who realize that their previous stance of saying, we're not going to negotiate, our group came first in the early elections, so we should be the ones to govern, didn't get them anywhere. They were completely sidelined under Barnier. And so now I suppose the idea is, okay, we want in. to this new government. So the far left doesn't agree with this. They still think that they should hold to the stance of not negotiating with Macron and not participating in the government. But that's what's shifting right now, and that's what Macron's plan is when he convened all of these people, including most parties on the left, to meet with him.
So, I mean, is there an obvious kingmaker? Where does the balance of power lie within the group?
Absolutely. Our colleagues at Le Monde have a wonderful National Assembly simulator where you can select, you can click and unclick all of the different parties that make up this fragmented Assemblée Nationale. And the picture that emerges is that the clear kingmakers here are the Socialist Party and their 60-something members of the legislature. If they decide to play ball, the government will have enough people who agree not to censure the government in order for that government to be able to conduct kind of lowest common denominator business, passing a budget, passing essential laws, etc. I think that's a low bar, but that is the bar currently. We shouldn't be dreaming, as I was after, I must admit, after the early elections, that some kind of German-style grand coalition might emerge with moderate right, moderate left, and Emmanuel Macron's party all kind of coming together to govern with a sensible middle-of-the-road way. That's not going to happen because Macron is so unpopular that none of the parties that are not his own want to carry the responsibility for leading a government in such a toxic political environment. But that being said, an agreement on not toppling the government out of hand, it seems within reach.
And is that the only kind of compromise that will be made, do you think? Or are they willing to think about that more and work together?
I think that's the compromise that they can get to right now. The issue that's very sensitive is that the president is extremely unpopular, and his agenda, including his signature retirement reform, is also highly unpopular. And so I think moderate parties recognize that it is necessary at the moment to return to a place where the very basic business of the legislature, passing a budget, for instance, needs to be able to happen, even if they have very significant policy disagreements on what the best direction to take the country is. But the extremists don't agree. So that's why Macron is trying to bring all these people together. I don't think they're all keeping in mind the presidential elections that are happening in 2027, and they don't want to essentially become associated with President Macron's legacy. I think that's what this positioning is all about. So, tacit support by way of not overthrowing the government or agreeing not to overthrow the government is the maximum that we can expect, I believe, right now.
Right. And today, the Cabinet's due to sign off on an emergency legislation to roll over the 2024 budget. Can you just tell us more about that? What does that mean for the future of budgetary decisions?
Well, essentially, this is an emergency bill that's going to allow the most kind of bare bones operations of the government, namely raising taxes and borrowing money on the basis of what the last year's budget was and all of the different kind of allocations for which ministry gets how much money, etc. So it's really a question of avoiding a American-style government shutdown. So yes, the cabinet is meeting today with the president at 10 a.m. local time, and then the parliament is expected to examine this bill and hopefully pass it, because even if we didn't see a big tumbling of the markets or any kind of interest rate hikes, the spread between the interest rates that France borrows at and its European kind of counterparts like Greece borrow at didn't change much after Michel Barnier's government was toppled, because I suppose the markets had already priced that risk in. But if there's further instability and even the most basic acts of raising taxes and borrowing money are impossible, then we might see further economic damage, let's say.
Now, Macron says he'll pick a prime minister within the next 48 hours. Who do we think?
Well, there is a clear front-runner at the moment, but not one that many people seem satisfied by, and that is the mayor of the city of Pau, François Bayrou, the longtime leader of the MoDem moderate party. I think because he is very centrist and he has some stances that the left can agree on and some stances that the right can agree on. I think he is kind of the front runner at the moment, but he's not somebody that very many people are extremely enthusiastic about. But at the moment, as we've been discussing, I think it's more about trying to come to an agreement about what the red lines of the moderates are and kind of move forward bit by bit. The expression that comes back over and over again in political commentary here in France is texte par texte, which means essentially bill by bill. Instead of having a broad common policy, it's going to be, okay, these are everybody's red lines that we're not going to cross, and then we're going to take it one step at a time, one bill at a time. What do we do on retirement reform? What do we do on support for farmers? What do we do on support for industry, etc.? So it's going to be a way more granular way of governing, but it seems like it's the only way forward.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. That's Simon Bouvier in Paris, and this is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Robin Brandt, BBC's former China correspondent. Robin, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I need to congratulate you. You've been doing this for a few months now, and today you actually worked out how the coffee machine worked.
You sounded so earnest, and I thought, what is this? Is something I don't know? It turns out I know how to press a button and find the milk.
You know what? It's really complicated, though. That machine's really needy.
I'm in. I've made it.
You did.
No turning back
and
now.
I can see your coffee there, and it smells great. That's a hint to my colleagues. I'm ready for a top-up. Robin, we've just been hearing about France and the complete kind of chaos, political chaos there. They're not alone. Germany, too.
No, but it's a slower march, isn't it, for Olaf Scholz and Germany's current Chancellor. But his decline has been much more gradual, but it now looks inevitable because he is going to call for a confidence vote in the lower house of the Bundestag on Monday. He's going to lose that. And then almost inevitably, Germany will be heading for a general election. I think 6-7 months earlier, that will come towards the end of February next year. And let's just remind ourselves of how catastrophic in a way Olaf Scholz's leadership has been. I think he'll end up being the shortest term SPD chancellor that Germany has had, and he leaves Germany in a pretty ragged state. A winter recession is on the horizon. Layoffs at VW, an unprecedented industrial event in this country. And the prospect of the Conservative bloc, the CDU, the CSU, replacing it when that election comes.
And of course, Angela Merkel's just released her autobiography.
Well, I did wonder, as she tours Europe, including here in the UK, peddling her wares, what her view would be of the current situation, but perhaps almost more importantly, the revisionism, if there is some going on, in terms of her leadership and what her inheritance was, and the extent to which we can make an even more informed judgment about that now, as one of her successors struggles so much.
Let's go to India, because India is really repositioning itself as a global power, and it's talking to everybody. It's really trying to make sure that it's got its comms open. But Russia, it seems, is really quite close.
Yeah, I mean, historically, they've always been very close. But now, as India becomes the world's most populous country and an increasingly even more significant economic behemoth, we're reminded of the political alliance and the strategic alliance that these two countries have always had. But now, as India becomes even more preeminent in terms of its economic might, we're reminded of what a significant player it continues to become on the global stage. And look, in some respects, to be overly simplistic, it hasn't been a good week for Russia. It has not been a good week for Vladimir Putin in terms of the demise of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the prospect possibly of losing the strategic interest that Russia has there on the eastern coast in Syria. But in Moscow yesterday, we see India's defense minister meeting with Vladimir Putin, both sides reminding them of their kind of undying relationship, their undying loyalty. There's a prospect of Vladimir Putin going to see Narendra Modi in India for a state visit next year. And I think the reason why it's so interesting is because India has become even more economically significant. As I said, now the world's most populous country, and it continues to position itself as a buffer between that great regional rival with which it borders, China to its north and its east, but also the United States and the extent to which that poses strategic challenges to India. And it's to Russia that it has often gone for diplomatic support, but also for huge military support. I mean, India has always bought, although that's diversifying a little bit now, much of its military materiel from Russia, and has relied on Russia to supply its navy, its army, and that relationship continues.
The Times of India, though, is saying that there is a problem with that supply chain because, of course, Russia's no longer in a position to be has any kind of extra resources. No, it's all going to the war.
Those ships, those Sukhois, those artillery shells are no longer there. And I think also the challenges within the supply chain in terms of the sanctions that Russia itself is facing. So there's a diversification in terms of the supply chain going on, a de-risking, if you were, that we're seeing the European Union do in many other respects in terms of its supply chain. But India continues to have a very close relationship with Russia. I thought it was fascinating yesterday just to be reminded of that because on one very simple level, we see Russia as being a country that has very few friends at the moment, and yet India, with its huge economic might, remains very loyal.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Argentina. They have banned political names on buildings and they've taken statues down. What's going on? Why?
Yeah, there's no revolution there. It's what Javier Milei wants almost a year into his presidency. And he continues to be on the march, and in this respect, an iconoclastic march. You know, let's just remind ourselves of the achievements, in a way, in terms of inflation in that country, in terms of the value of its currency. And there is much commentary and analysis at the moment in terms of Javier Milei, the madman of Argentinian politics, and what he seems to have achieved in terms of stabilising that country's economy. But at the same time, he wants to ensure that impartiality remains something important in terms of Argentinian politics. And we're seeing new rules and regulations put in place that are seeing busts of very famous national figures in the past and illustrations and images of people like Eva Perón and even more recent leaders, Cristina de Kirchner, removed from buildings as innocent you would have thought as post offices, because he wants to see make it quite clear that the use of these national estates for any kind of propaganda or any kind of propagation of a personality or political cult is not something that can continue. And so we're seeing new rules and regulations implemented in the country, images removed, busts of very famous national leaders or first ladies in the past removed. And it's meant to be something that can ensure that no more continuation of that cult of personality, something that has been incredibly significant in Argentinian politics, and you might even argue is continuing with Milei himself.
There's that fantastic fantastic it's a sort of profile of Eva Perón on the side of a building in the middle of Buenos Aires. Absolutely iconic. I can't imagine the city without that.
But that seems to be exactly the kind of image that he has in his targets. And we're seeing an interesting definition of the rules and regulations going forward that will permit people to use such images in the future. I mean, even Perón is okay because the new rules mean that 10 years must pass between the death of a figure and their use of their image or a use of their a bust of them in such a way as you've described. So she's fine for now, but nonetheless, we're seeing that buildings as evil as innocent as post offices are having illustrations of previous leaders removed because it's that kind of iconography that he doesn't want to see.
Now, how much would you pay for a bit of ham?
Not 80,000 euros. I mean, this one's a cracker. Joselito in Salamanca, apparently they are the creme de la creme of Iberian ham. There is a pig's leg, basically, that's been around since 2006 that is now going under the hammer. Apparently not all hams can go up to 18 years, we're told. I mean, thank God for that. The prospect of, slicing into this one, discovering it really wasn't quite as good as you thought. But this is the best of the best, the black Iberian pig. This company in Salamanca is the kind of the best of the best. It has one from 2006, what it is now getting ready to auction. There are others as well. Apparently it has 80 or so legs that are older than 8 years. But this one's going to go for up to 80,000 euros. But they are quite discerning, I read in El País. Not just anyone can buy this. It has to be someone who, quote, understands it.
How do you go about understanding your jamón?
I don't know. I mean, the bottom line is you're going to eat it, you're going to appreciate it, aren't you? I recall being at a gathering in China with some friends, actually, where someone had employed someone to come in and slice the ham. I mean, the ritual was phenomenal. The taste was beautiful. But, 80,000 euros is not something I can even begin to comprehend. But if you're interested in it, you have to understand it first. Right.
Robin, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The International Rescue Committee, the IRC aid organisation, says that Sudan has topped a 2025 watch list of global humanitarian crises released today. The report said the humanitarian crisis in Sudan was the largest since records began and that the country accounts for 10% of all people in humanitarian need, despite being home to just 1% of the global population. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will submit a request to Parliament today to hold a vote of confidence, the necessary precursor to holding new federal elections after the collapse of his coalition last month. Scholz is expected to lose the vote, slated for December the 16th, as his government no longer has a majority. He must then request the president to dissolve Parliament, triggering new elections. And South Korean police raided the office of President Yoon Suk-yeol in a widening investigation into the embattled leader's failed attempt to impose martial law. However, he's not been arrested or questioned by authorities, though he is banned from leaving the country. The National Police Chief has been detained over the martial law declaration, and the former defence minister, also a close confidant of Yoon, has attempted suicide at a detention centre. This is The Globalist. It's 9:32 in Kyiv, 8:32 in Zurich. Now, several papers are carrying the headline, China cutting off drone supplies to Ukraine. This is surprising, as it wasn't generally known that that was, in fact, the case. The concern was around China possibly supplying Russia with weapons with which to attack Ukraine. So joining me now to discuss this is Monocle's writer and researcher, Juliet Lassica, who is, in fact, Ukrainian. Juliet, what do we know about China's weapons trade with Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Well, it's not so much an official weapons trade, as you were saying. It's much more unofficial. So at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, and of course before that, but, it really ramped up then, Ukrainians, volunteers, soldiers, anyone who was working with the army was buying these little drones, first-person view drones, from China. You literally go on a Chinese website and you type in, your Ukrainian address or your European address or wherever you want to sort of ship it to, and it will come directly to you there. Then there are all these, there's this network of small workshops all around Ukraine where these drones would then be modified and they would be They would be changed, so they would have little accessories added to them. Throughout the war, throughout the full-scale invasion, they've actually been made lethal, so they can now carry grenades or little bombs to drop on Russians, or they're just used for reconnaissance. So they have become this really, really vital part. In fact, lots of Ukrainians were saying that, when the US aid was sort of stopped in the spring of this year, and now, of course, there's this advance on Pokrovsk, which is a really strategic point for Ukrainians. These drones, these tiny little FPV, first-person view drones from China that have been modified by Ukrainians, these are such an integral part of Ukraine's defence.
Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about some government-to-government military arrangement here. This is literally people buying it off the internet. Why is it coming to an end?
So this is part of the escalating trade war between China and the US, is Ukraine getting caught in the crosshairs of this. But I think it's also part of the supply chain. Where are we getting little things from? So Ukrainians, for example, now have really tried to diversify. It's been a massive sort of conversation in the national security circles. How can we diversify away from China? Because there are so many important parts. Even if you've tried to start building the drone yourself, which many Ukrainians have been doing, and that's a really dynamic part of Ukraine's military sort of strategy, and there have been great breakthroughs. People are making thermal imagery cameras on their own now. The drone parts themselves are being made from 3D printers, but the small electronic parts, the transistors and the little things that you need to make electronic parts work, that all comes from China, those small, cheap bits.
Let's move on and have a look at this row now, because Ukraine's been pushing back at the US about lowering the draft age. What's Zelensky said about the idea of 18-year-olds being conscripted?
He's totally against it. And most people in Ukrainian society are. That's not the way forward, they say. For them, there have been way too many men in Ukrainian society who are both abroad and within Ukraine itself, specifically in the sort of Kyiv region and the central regions where the power lies, that haven't been conscripted, that have been let off, or are draft dodgers, they say. So they're saying that there needs to be a much more comprehensive approach taken to the mobilization drive, which many critics of Zelensky say that he's never been brave enough to do. He's never been brave enough to broach that. There has to be a comprehensive drive. People have to be brought into the army, not afraid, not sort of bundled into buses and taken away, which is what Russian propaganda is really playing on here, and playing on that fear of the 18-year-old boys being taken away from their mothers. But there has to be a comprehensive approach. People have to go through proper training. They have to know that they'll be given proper weapons to defend themselves. They won't just sort of be flung onto the front line and used as cannon fodder. There have been approaches outside Ukraine. For example, Poland has launched the Ukrainian Legion, which is where they recruit men from within Poland, Ukrainian men with Ukrainian passports. They then train them. They give them very thorough training, and they promise to supply them weapons. And then these men are transferred to the Ukrainian army, where they are linked to Poland and they're supplied weapons and uniform, etc., by Poland, but they're taken to fight for Ukraine.
And so Zelensky, we know, is continuing to try and end the war. There's talk of a diplomatic solution. That's alarming people, presumably because it comes with the idea of some kind of concession on territory. Just tell us how Ukrainians feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that percentage of Ukrainians who are willing to talk about a territorial concession or some sort of ceasefire is growing, because there's just such enormous fatigue, and there's this feeling that it's impossible to win the war at the current pace that things are going. But then at the same time, there are others that are saying, look, Russia is so bogged down. They're suffering the greatest losses that they have so far. I mean, it's enormous, the number of men that they're losing every single day with their sort of crazy sort of cannon fodder strategy where they just send men out and expect them to be gunned down to make Ukrainians waste their ammunition. So I think that there's fear, because if there is a ceasefire now, many Ukrainians say that it will be the same as it happened after 2014 when there were the Minsk agreements, so after Russia annexed Crimea, and then they occupied parts of eastern Ukraine, and then there were these Minsk agreements that froze the front line. Putin just used that as a moment to regroup, rebuild the economy, rebuild his army, and also make diplomatic links with people around the world, rebuild his image, his diplomatic image.
Julia, thank you very much indeed. And if people would like to hear from a soldier on the front line, do tune in to Meet the Writers. Lieutenant Julia, female lieutenant on the front line, commanding a lot of soldiers, a reconnaissance brigade, I understand, has written a book called How Good It Is I Have No Fear of Dying, and she's fascinating to listen to. That's Julia Lasker there, and this is The Globalist. On Friday, Taiwan's President Lai Chi-do returned from a tour of the Pacific, which included the US territory of Guam and the state of Hawaii, a visit that predictably angered China, who see the territory he governs democratically as their own. And, as they tend to do in these circumstances, they've launched military drills. But this time, it's much bigger. It's a much bigger deployment of their Navy fleet in regional waters than in nearly 3 decades. Alessio Patalano is a professor at King's College London and an expert on Asian defence. He joins me now. Alessio, welcome back. How has Taiwan described the situation?
So, as you would expect, the Taiwanese have described the situation as one of great concern. They were ready for it. There was an expectation because now there's a familiar playbook, if you want, with the Chinese taking opportunities every time the circumstances allow them. To send a message not only to the Taiwanese, but also to use that message as a way to test elements of their coercive strategy. This time, they were expecting something big would happen, something that would be put in place on a relatively short notice, albeit the trip that Lai did was something that was known. So, yes, put on short notice, but no, it was also kind of unknown. So one was expecting this would happen. What I think the Taiwanese authorities were not fully clear about, one of the things that the Taiwanese authorities were not clear about was how this would unfold. If you remember from the previous 2 exercises, towards Part A and Part B, different components of the military and different type of activities had come together. This time, hello?
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry, this time it was a question of what would be the shocking element, if you want. And this time what we discovered, the scale, the magnitude, and the fact not that it was just big, but that Taiwan was one of 3 components. It was a 3 theater in the East China Sea, in the Straits of Taiwan, and in the South China Sea. And that's perhaps the most remarkable thing about it.
Because as you say, and it is much, much bigger. There are 3 areas here. There are also analysts have laid out 2 possible maritime quarantine scenarios. What are those?
So this is something that was already transpired with Joint Sword Part B. This is the deployment of different type of assets from the military and the Chinese Coast Guard that would basically put in place some sort of inspection controlled. So you have to go back and reach to the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis when the United States put on a quarantine on shipping going into Cuba to intercept what they knew were the components for a missile system, because it is absolutely allowed in international law to put on a quarantine if a particular sort of state entity is receiving materials, components for example, combat system, weapons, capabilities of various kinds that would be considered as a threat to a country's national security. And so the Chinese this time had components of their operational activity during this exercise that would be useful in the case of a quarantine of parts of the East China Sea, parts of the Straits of Taiwan. Last time it was very clear the way it was implemented that the offshore islands controlled by Taiwan but close to the coast of Fujian would be the first one to be under this type of activity. But if you want, this was a further explanation of how they would sort of implement that type of action rather than a real novelty. The real novelty this time was the scale and the coordination of that scale over 3 different theatres. That was something that we had not seen before.
And possibly meant as a message, particularly to the US. Do we know what incoming US President Donald Trump's attitude towards Taiwan's sovereignty is?
So this is a very good question because, as you can imagine, in the run-up to January, when there will be the installment of the new presidents and the president of the new government. There's been quite a flurry of articles being published in the last few weeks by people that are either just leaving the administration or people that are just about to go into the administration. And for the time being, you can certainly see that within the Team Trump, there are those who recognize the significance of Taiwan strategically to the United States. But there are also some who say, well, Taiwan is not essential. It should be looked at as a part of a broader picture of a negotiation over economic matters with China. Now, what is interesting, though, is that contrary to early assessments of what President Trump would do, and again, this is all theoretical because the president-elect hasn't really spoken about it one way or another, one thing seems to be absolutely clear is that the general sort of mood of the room of those who've been nominated at the highest places in the National Security Council, State Department, is one which would suggest that times with China are going to be tough. So the question is really to what extent and in what ways Taiwan will be used within that sort of broader relationship. Outgoing administration officials have started to suggest that China has moved to the goalpost of the basic principles of China-Taiwan sort of Taiwan policy, that the next administration should really review those. So regardless of how it swings, I think it is fair to suggest that we're in for a few months during which the president might actually reconcile the parts of the traditional, if you want, a position of the United States over the status of Taiwan. And within that context, this might actually, or the relationship with China and the so-called economic war with China might actually be the factor that shapes which way it goes.
Alessia, thank you very much indeed. That's Alessia Patalano, and you're with Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now it's time to talk urbanism with my lovely colleague Jessica Bridger. She's a journalist, she's a consultant on urbanism. She's been in Singapore and now she's back in Zurich. Jessica, welcome home, I guess it is.
It is wonderful to be home, Georgina.
But Singapore was great, right?
It was excellent. I got the chance to teach some very interesting students. We did really nice public realm design projects, and now I'm home to discover the rest of the world.
Excellent. Well, let's start your journey of discovery with urban forests around the globe. Tell us more.
So urban forests are a growing global topic of interest with urbanists as we rediscover the value of our urban trees en masse. So this is getting beyond just street trees and into much larger plantings. So a study published last month by RMIT used the 3-30-300 rule, which was created by Dutch urban forestry expert Professor Cecile Konendijk. And this means, can you see 3 trees from your window? Does the urban tree canopy shade 30% of the city? And can you find a park within 30 meters of buildings? They looked at 8 global cities, including Seattle, Melbourne, Singapore, and Amsterdam, and only Singapore passed all 3 criteria.
So how is that being addressed?
So this is something where we recognize that urban green has climate change impacts. So forest canopy offers significant cooling and also fundamental public health gains. People in places with more green space, even only 1 tree visible from their window, have lower incidences of depression, anxiety, obesity, and heat stroke. So trees should be seen as infrastructure of critical importance and not just street decoration. So if we think of amazing urban areas, they're often the ones ones that are transected by green boulevards with green lungs stretching into them. In cities, from Sao Paulo to Beijing to Tbilisi have active urban forest projects, including both large-scale planting and maintenance and test plots for future action.
Mm-hmm. What about microforests planted using a Japanese method?
So because we can't always achieve the scale that we might want, there is a Japanese method called the Miyawaki method, and that establishes small but dense forest communities that can be interknit into dense urban places. And that is one method. And we also do have really large scale urban forest projects active, such as the Mtatsminda Orokana urban forest in Tbilisi, which is led by landscape architects Ruderl, where they're restoring 80 hectares of urban forest that help cool the city. This is left over from Soviet planning and was kind of left derelict, but it's now being restored. And the project also helped to revive the nursery industry for large-scale landscape actions like this, and it was up for an EU Mies Award this year.
It sounds absolutely excellent, wonderful projects here. Another great project I'm very interested in is this festival forest. What can you tell us about that?
So this is a super interesting initiative, which is trying to leverage the European love or general love of European open-air festivals with carbon sequestration. As we know, forests can absorb large amounts of carbon and store it. And this project seeks to plant diverse ranges of trees on festival grounds throughout Europe. And right now there's a major initiative happening in Iceland.
It sounds like a great thing, and it's a way for people who go to lots of festivals around the world, as I do, to offset their carbon footprint. And you contribute, and trees will be planted in your name for this initiative, which is run as a charity. Let's have a look at Shanghai. You've just been there, right?
So I was in Shanghai last month, and I was really struck by the amazing urban structure of the city. It was a really amazing place to visit. But driving an hour from Jiading, which is an industrial node in the city's outskirts, to the center, I was really struck by something. And that was a shocking number of the cars were electric. And that continued when I was on the ground in central Shanghai. You don't really understand how loud and dirty fuel cars are until they aren't there. Mm-hmm. And even multi-lane roads were really quiet in the city, and walking long distances, I experienced really very little ambient air pollution. And that's very interesting because Shanghai used to be one of the leaders globally for air pollution. But over the past decade, that has improved immensely. Now the city has over 320 days a year which are considered good or excellent. And the introduction, or the kind of minimization of selling new fuel cars, has been a direct contributor to this. Now, since July, over 50% of cars sold in China overall are NEVs, or new energy vehicles, including battery electric, hydrogen, and also hybrids.
So just looking at the air quality, I mean, it used to be very poor, but now it's great.
Yeah. And that's really amazing. And a direct contributor to that is the fact that 20% of vehicles in Shanghai, so 1.28 million, are NEVs. And that is the highest share and largest fleet of NEVs in any city in the world. And let's keep in mind that Shanghai has a population of about 25 million people. So if Shanghai can do it, then can't we all?
Absolutely. Jessica, thank you very much. Welcome home. Very glad that you're back in Switzerland, and we'll be in much more regular contact. Jessica Bridger there. This is The Globalist. Regular listeners to The Globalist will know that during these cold winter months, we've turned our attention to Finland. From the country's official soundscape, which you can listen to on Monocle.com, to its most famous resident, Santa Claus, who'll be travelling from his hometown of Rovaniemi for a special appearance at Monocle's London Christmas market this weekend. We're celebrating all things Finnish this festive season. And today, we're focusing on the country's thriving landscape for entrepreneurship. Monocle's Tom Edwards caught up with the ambassador of Finland to the UK, that's Jukka Siukosaari, and Business Finland's director for Western Europe, that's Jukka Holappa, to explore the opportunities the country has to offer. Tom began by asking His Excellency what makes Finland so attractive for entrepreneurs.
Finland is a great country to make a living, to establish yourself. And that starts not only from the business perspective, but also from life in general. So it's a good place to raise children. It's a great place to enjoy nature. Finland has been recognized as the happiest nation in the world for 7 years in a row, and not in vain, I think. So we have been able to create a society where it's good for people to live in and good for them to feel safe and secure.
And I guess that safety, that security, that quality of life, something we like to think we know a little bit about here at Monocle, Jukka, that is something that it translates very elegantly to fertility for business as well, doesn't it? I guess because it's stable, right? Because it's secure. There's a really robust foundation upon which to build.
Professionally, Finland is the best environment in the world. There are many reasons for that. Very cool technology ecosystem, probably best in the world. But what I like about Finland is that the organizational structures are extremely flat. So you basically have access to everybody in Finland. What is surprising to many people when I describe then the Finnish ecosystem and the opportunities there, it's not only the Finnish companies. The large global companies are deeply involved in the Finnish ecosystem. So you can work in Google in Finland, you can work in Microsoft in Finland, you can work in GE Healthcare, do R&D in Finland. So there are opportunities in the global companies in Finland as well, in this nice flat organization structure.
And Ambassador, it's interesting, we were talking a little bit before, but there is something about the openness, how receptive Finland and Finns are to exactly that kind of inward investment. There are some unique qualities that enable Finland to be this effective base for so many people from wherever they come.
Let me start with the language first. Finnish is a very peculiar language and rather difficult for foreigners to learn, but that has also led to the fact that in Finland you can easily get by with many of the global languages, of course English being the first one of them. And then we are also a bilingual country, so Swedish and Finnish are both official languages of the country, and especially on the coastal regions you can easily get by with Swedish if you have that when you move into the country. And actually many foreigners opt for using Swedish rather than Finnish as their first language in the country simply because Swedish is more related to the other European languages. But then I would like to also raise the concept of trust, the trust between individuals. You can trust that your neighbor is going to do what he or she has said, and the Finns also trust their institutions, and that is a tremendous strength for the society, that we know that what has been written in the rules and the regulations is kept. There's extremely low levels of corruption. We regularly come number one in the Transparency International's measurements of corruption in the positive sense. So it is an easy environment to do business in that sense, that you know that what is written and what is promised will also be kept.
Well, and just on its place in the world, Finland is well positioned, right? We often talk here about it being a gateway, kind of flying across the top of the world, if you like. But do you think there's a tendency for people to sort of almost overlook Finland? And actually, even its physical location is very advantageous.
Yes, I mean, it's quite understandable. When you look at the map or the globe, Finland is always on the right top-hand side of the whatever perception you have. So it's easy to think that we are peripheral. But in today's world, it has less and less meaning. So if the physical connectivity is in place, which it is for Finland, we have very good flight connections to every European capital and also to Asia. And then what is, of course, important is the information infrastructure, that you have good connections for moving data and information quickly from within the country, but also from the country abroad. And that is something that Finland has been investing in a lot on connectivity.
Connectivity, technology, sustainability, robust foundations. It's an attractive picture. You could talk to me a little bit about the specifics of maybe some sectors that embody these qualities.
I could maybe start with the industry which people usually think is the most boring industry in the world, which is Finnish pulp and paper industry, which has been extremely important for Finland, not for decades, but for hundreds of years. So the traditional boring Finnish pulp and paper industry will be the global leader when it comes to new sustainable bio-based materials in the future. Whether it's, materials that can replace plastics, packaging materials, textiles even. So I think that is a wonderful example what is possible in Finland.
Jukka Holappa there, and Finland's ambassador to the UK, Jukka Siukosaari, in conversation with Monocle's Tom Edwards. And for more stories on better business, tune in to The Entrepreneurs every Wednesday at 2000 London time. That's it for today's show. Thanks to our producers Tom Webb, Carlotta Rebello and Hassan Anderson, our researchers and our studio manager Flynn Simons, with the editing assistant from Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. I'll be back on The Briefing at midday London time, and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.